Hey, welcome to another edition of Real Talk. Today, we do some revision. Today, we go back to persuasion, but we look at persuasion in the context of conformity because there's various forms of persuasion, as we spoke about in the past, where it's reciprocity and identification of things of this nature. But let's look at conformity because this is a really, really intriguing subject. Many people would say that in the Western world, we're here in Britain, for example, one of the pillars of democracy. But is this really a conformist society? Do we really have that free will and freedom? Or is it that we comply and we're conforming out of fear of social exclusion or chastisement? You often hear people talk in the political realm, some of our political leaders, and talk about things like British values, as if someone who is in this country and who obeys the law, it isn't sufficient for them to be law abiding, but there are some values now that they are supposed to be adhering to. Some people look to the movie The Matrix, one of the things from the popular culture that has kind of shaped many ideas and critiques and analysis of the types of societies that we live in the Western world, in terms of how people are just working to live. Living to work, should I say, as opposed to working to live. And that there is a programming going on in the media, and that's why we watch TV programs, because we're being programmed. We're almost like this kind of a Manchurian candidate that has been pumped with this information, and we just comply on command, almost like the Pavlovian dog, when the bell, he's been conditioned so long that when Pavlov's dog, when the psychologist did the experiment, he had a dog and he would ring a bell and feed the dog food, and after a while the dog associated he was conditioned into associating the sound of the bell with food, that he would salivate at the sound of the bell. So after a while, even when food wasn't produced but just the bell was rung, he would salivate. So some people are saying that these are some of the techniques and forms of social engineering that they are using. Those architects, those social engineers, those people who come up with the ideas and parts of think tanks, using all this knowledge, this dastardly knowledge of psychology to inform or misinform and to condition the populace. So what is conformity? Conformity is about yielding to group pressure. It's about changing beliefs and changing behavior to that of the group. But there are a number of reasons why people do this. There are different types of conformity. People comply with the beliefs and attitudes of the group, and sometimes this is done just for public acceptance. This means that ultimately they maintain their original beliefs, they maintain their original behaviors and attitudes in private. Sometimes people say this is what happens with things like prejudice and racism and attitudes to sexism. We live in a culture of political correctness. So what people say in public is one thing, but what they really believe behind closed doors is another thing. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because people should be, the public domain should be somewhere where people feel free from oppression. So, you must have freedom of thought, right? Unless we're living in 1984 and we have groupthink. So people comply for publicly, so you have public types of compliance, the public one, right? Then you have the internalization type of compliance, where a person really does internalize those beliefs, that they've accepted the beliefs and ideas and the behaviors of a particular group. Then there's the identification type of conformity. But this is where people are trying to create for themselves a particular self-image, a healthy and likable self-image. So they internalize the behavior traits and they internalize the beliefs of a particular group. And when I say group, it can be any type of group. This can be along religious lines, it could be political lines, it could be a social group, it could be mannerisms, it could be acquaintance, and just minor behaviors. It's, as I've mentioned before, and as an intern, I worked in a prison establishment, and I saw how much of a conformist society, a kind of a subculture it is, that there will be individuals that had come to prison for the first time, never been part of the side of life, and were like students from really squeaky clean homes and environments. And within a matter of days or weeks of being in that environment, their behavior had conformed to somebody that had been hardcore, because there was an environment. They had to conform to save face and to protect themselves. They had to assume the beliefs and practices, at least overtly, of the group. I guess we would call that kind of conformity a type of public. So there was a public persona that they had to adhere to survive in that type of atmosphere. Sometimes conformity is normative. It's about being it's a fear of rejection. It's just a fear of rejection and being rejected by the group. So people people adhere to this type of behavioral trait and assume certain attitudes because they just want to be accepted. Just like me, please do. Then there's the conformity that takes place due to ignorance or the absence of knowledge. Ignorance sounds like a loaded term, so we'll say the absence of knowledge. And sometimes people don't know quite how to act in a certain situation, or what's the MO, the modus operandi in a particular sphere of where they are. So they defer to the group, but let's see what everybody else does, or let's see what that comes up in group dynamics when you see that some groups naturally have a leader. Sometimes there's a leadership conflict, and then the alpha will appear, and but there's usually a rivalry and conflicts and things of this nature before these things can be established amongst human beings. And then there's some people who they lack information, so they're looking for that alpha. They're looking for leaders. They're looking for leadership. So then that's how they defer their own judgment and accept that of the leaders. There's a really, really interesting study I want to touch on. It took place probably over 30 years ago at Stanford University in the United States. It involved 21 participants. This is a really, really interesting how we're influenced, persuasion, influence, conformity. These are all not meaning the same thing, but they cross paths in the textbooks, these terminologies and these ideas. So in Stanford University, 21 participants were involved in this experiment, and they were either going to be applied to or assigned to two different groups. It was the university basement was transformed into a prison. Those participants that were going to be prisoners, again, were arrested by local sheriffs and brought to arrested and brought to the prison in the university basement. Those that were going to be prison guards were given uniforms. They were given dark glasses with reflector lenses, so the eye contact couldn't be made, or it was a kind of intimidating, face-off between guards and prisoner. They were given billy clubs. They weren't allowed to administer violence. They were given whistles also as well. They weren't allowed to actually be violent to the participants, stroke prisoners, but they were there to implant discipline. And what they found out was that they were so cruel and so intense in their administration of discipline once they got into the role play, once they got into the mindset of being a prison guard, that even going to the toilet was seen as a privilege that one had to earn by good behavior. The prison experiment was so intense. Some of the prisoners, about at least 5 of them, started to show acute signs of anxiety and depression, and they had to be released from the study early because that's how intense it got real in there. It got real in there. Now, what's really interesting about that study is that not only do we learn about de-individuation, or when people don't have, when they feel unidentified, for example, and they're in a group, they act in a certain way. But what's interesting is that with this knowledge that's been in the academic circles for all these years, it's been known, studies of that nature have been repeated, but as we live in a democratic society, as I started this out, have you not noticed, one can observe or one can question, that the police who administer crowd control of people exercising their democratic right to demonstrate have adopted different types of uniform, which their numbers are not visible anymore, so they're not identifiable. And the literature says that when you have de-individuation, that people act more, let's say, risque or aggressively, or it changes behavior because one is not responsible now as an individual, but one is not part of this wholeness. And if you look at, again, other countries, other democratic countries where there's demonstrations, that the police have this type of, or law enforcement, have this type of Robocop and paramilitary uniform, and then the behavior seems to accompany and just reminds one of the Stanford experiment. It's really interesting. Today we don't provide all the answers, but just food for thought. Hope to see you on The Real Talk next time.